record. There we go. Hello, everyone. Happy election night. I hope that you've had a great Tuesday. We are so grateful, as always, at Moving Writers for your time. Every moment you give us to read something or to leave a comment or to tweet something at us, and especially to give us your after school moments to learn with us. We are just incredibly grateful. And we're so excited you're here. I am so excited to be here to learn from my friend Sochi Bentley, who has brought so much, I know you agree with me, to the Moving Writers community over the last year. And truly, while we have lots of amazing writers who write for us at Moving Writers, it's not often that someone consistently teaches me so much that is brand new to me and makes me see writing in a totally new way. And that's what Sochi has done over the last year with her writing about writing, and bringing the environment and bringing nature and bringing place-based writing into our curriculum. I have honestly started using her techniques in my classroom. She has given me an amazing reading list over the last year. Like anything Sochi recommends I read or use as a mentor text, I instantly get it. Like World of Wonders has become one of my favorite books of all time. And I got that from one of Sochi's posts. So I know that you are excited to learn from her too, as we look tonight at bringing the environment, bringing climate stewardship and place-based practices into our writing classrooms. So I am going to get out of the way and I'm going to turn it over to Sochi. Sochi, thank you so much for doing this for all of us tonight.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for such a warm, generous welcome, Rebecca. I'm thrilled to be here with you all and just tell you a little bit about myself as before we get started. I teach 11th grade and 12th grade English at a high school in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And so all the strategies and lessons that I mentioned tonight are things that are tried and true. I've tried them very recently in the last couple of years. I've made tweaks and adjusted them. So I'm really speaking from firsthand experience about how I'm trying to marry our focus on reading and writing with environmental stewardship. And just clicking my slides. Don't mean to have technical difficulties so early.
Sometimes you have to click the little arrow at the, there you go, you got it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. And so something I learned really early on in trying to bring climate stewardship into the classroom is that even though my students heard the word sustainability all the time, many of them didn't know what it meant. They didn't really have like a clear reference point for the word that we bat around and so ubiquitous. And so to really anchor our work in a vision shared around the globe, we looked at a definition of sustainability that's in the UN climate report from 1987, Our Common Future. And it defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think this definition really resonates with what so many of our young climate activists are saying today, that we can't just be focused on ourselves in the present, that we really need to think about the needs of our descendants, as well as think about the lessons of our ancestors. And so when I think of Swedish activist Greta Thunberg and her tremendous TED Talk, something that she makes clear is that what we do right now or don't do right now will affect her entire life and the lives of her children and grandchildren. And so what we do or don't do right now, me and my generation can't undo in the future. And then when I think of Mexican activist Xie Bastida and her TED Talk, which I pair with Greta's, something that sticks out to me is her saying about her father, all of his words about the responsibility that we have as humans to live in balance with nature were passed down to me. And so when I pair these TED Talks at the beginning of a unit about climate stewardship, something that's very clear is that people that are the same age as my students are really emphasizing intergenerational awareness. Again, that we have to both look backwards and look forwards as we exist in this point in time. And so to the end of having intergenerational awareness in the ELA classroom, I like to talk about reading and writing as a future ancestor. And so when I'm backwards planning or designing a new lesson or trying something out, I really think with this rubric in mind, this framework rather, impact, access, and practice. So thinking about the impact, meaning reducing our carbon footprint, understanding feedback loops, cause and effect chains, and tipping points. If you're familiar with the UN climate report that came out a month or so ago, it's really quite emphatic about the need to do everything we can across the globe to avoid a tipping point beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, when it comes to access, thinking about access means understanding barriers, what barriers have historically existed. So thinking about how Indigenous people have been displaced from tribal lands, but also historical racist housing practices that really limited access to green gathering spaces in communities. When I say weighing leverage and intervention points, thinking about who are the policymakers that have the most opportunity and influence to affect change in environmental legislation. And then when I say building capacity, helping our students understand there's already so many great environmental organizations doing the work of climate stewardship that we need to find out who they are, or rather even start our own organizations and good work so that we can build this capacity and not feel like we're on our own. And when it comes to practice, and this is key, a major shift in my teaching, is making sure we're finding authentic audiences for student work. And giving them opportunities to engage in local storytelling and finding great mentor texts for helping them do so. And then norming new habits, as in the words of my student, that the intentions of Earth Day are actually practiced every day. And so what does this look like? It really means that we start by layering our reading practices. So I think of a fairly common strategy that I rely first read of a text, say, mean, matter. So this is something that a lot of language teachers think about. What does the text say? What does the author mean? And why does this matter? I still guide my students to consider these very important questions, but with impact, access, and practice in mind, I also am encouraging them and modeling, asking the question of what are the stakes? Who gets a say? And how do we repair and restore? So, for example, if we're reading Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, some of the things we might be thinking about is in terms of what are the stakes, what are the implications of the water shortage? And not just for the members of the walled community, but also the water peddlers and the corporation-funded coastal cities. When we ask the question, who gets a say, we might be thinking, how do we decide an equitable division of water? How does it get allocated and shared? And then with the question, how do we repair and restore? Really thinking about how can we manage our water equitably and avoid the problems with water privatization that we already see in our home state here in California. And so layering text is really great practice in thinking about how the environmental problems that are appearing in the stories we read, how we can see them emerging in real world contexts. So considering them simultaneously. So the first lesson idea that I am really happy to share, because it's always been so much fun and so helpful, is helping students make environmental justice comics. And so this segment of the webinar, I'll be talking about a really great pre-writing strategy, and but therefore, using a free digital storytelling website, Storyboard That, but also a case study, which is the presence of trees in Los Angeles through the lens of environmental justice. And I'll be sure to unpack that term. And so in designing this series of lessons, we really worked with a fantastic mentor text, a comic called Maya's Lot. And most of my students had never written or storyboarded a comic before. And so this was a great text for thinking about the use of thought bubbles, the use of speech bubbles, the use of juxtaposed frames or cells, close-ups for whether versus a scene, and then what use of captions could be considered ironic. And when I think about how comics has transformed my classroom space, it's really a wonderful memory tool that uses visual storytelling in a way that makes the stakes very clear. And so this helps students become scholar activists. And what I mean by that is that we're helping students share their findings so that action can be taken. Also, plotting or storyboarding through comics offers low stakes rehearsal for conversations outside school with higher stakes. It often is easier for my shyer students to give a presentation or to lead a discussion when they've plotted it out in storyboard form. Also, it just serves really as an important resource for sense making. How do we make sense of some of these very complicated climate problems? Giving clarity in the structure of a comic storyboard is one entry point. And so I'm really influenced by a book written by Randy Olson called Houston, We Have a Narrative. And he addresses a problem that I find cropping up in my classroom quite a bit, which is that, as he says, telling a simple story can be frustrating, but it may be the single most important challenge for all scientists. The tendency of scientists to present endless piles of facts, unable to find the singular narrative onto which everyone can focus, has become a reason many important science stories, including that of global warming, fail to resonate with the general public. And this really resonates with a situation that appears in my class when often my students will have done some research and time comes for them to share out the stage of their investigation or what are the findings so far. And when they're speaking, they're piling fact after fact after fact. And that is doing a lot in terms of showing their credibility as a speaker, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are telling a story in a compelling way. And I want them to understand that using storytelling, particularly with climate stewardship topics, is a way to create buy-in, is a way to make complex topics comprehensible. And so here's an example of a storyboard made with Storyboard That by a student, I believe 4 years ago. And we were practicing using the storyboard with the understanding that we were choosing to create visual narratives where both problems and solutions can be presented. And you can see here that she very cleverly wove images from the recent California wildfires with images from the app Storyboard That. And she did that to be deliberately eye-catching and make it more emotionally impactful to see the combination of real imagery with that which she just created using the comic cell. As I said before, it's really important that my students have opportunities to share their findings with authentic audiences. And so to that end, also 4 years ago, we did a comic exchange with elementary students in Japan. And so we storyboarded our comics about environmental issues we really cared about here in California. And we shared them with these students. And they in turn sent us hand-drawn comics. And we called this exchange Protecting Our Lives. And it really made the point clear that almost every climate problem is also a public health emergency, and that protect our lives is really at the cornerstone of what we're doing here, is figuring out how we can not only navigate the complexity of these issues, but also think about how we can feel emboldened and empowered by the examples and solutions that are happening elsewhere and abroad. And so I want to unpack the term environmental justice a little bit. In 1982, more than 500 protesters, many of them seasoned leaders of the civil rights movement here in the US, were protesting the dump of toxins in a landfill in one of the poorest places in Warren County, North Carolina. And one of the reasons this was so devastating, this was happening over a 5-year period, is it really was making a point of dumping toxins in a place that was an underserved community. And this is something that environmental justice tries to address and point out, that frequently it's our communities that are underserved that most frequently bear the brunt of the worst environmental impacts. And so even though they weren't able to successfully protest this landfill, it really did usher in the environmental justice movement, which has been tremendously influential. And looking at how the EPA defines environmental justice, says it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, origin, or income, in the developed implementation and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Everyone should receive the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and should have equal access to decision-making. And so this is a definition that I share with my students while we're working on our comics, because thinking about the way in which it applies, it can be seen in so many different places, gives them the tools to start to plot this narrative of place-based environmental justice problem solving. Here you can see an example of one student cell thinking about who has access to parks, gathering spaces, open spaces where we can just enjoy being outside, but also having access to clean air and clean water. And so the strategy, and this is really for us as a pre-writing strategy that we rely on quite a bit, I learned about from Randy Olson, the ABT storytelling method, which is and, but, therefore. And so there are 3 parts of the structure where you present the situation, then the complication, and then the resolution. And what we've noticed is that when my students use this ABT storytelling structure with their research and plotting their environmental justice narratives, all of a sudden it's really shrunk the narrative to like the essential core. All the extraneous details are pared away, and they've really identified the things that they want their audience to remember. And so an example of what this looks like, we'll see with Maya's Lot. And I really encourage you to look at this comic. It is online. And here we can see it being used. A girl lives in Forestville, New York, and tends a garden off the lot off Lincoln and 121st. But she realizes company plans to store toxic waste on the lot. Therefore, she mobilizes community members to speak at the neighborhood council meeting to halt the company development. And so you see 3 parts here: the situation, the complication, and the resolution. And I also just want to mention that Maya's Lot is available, narrated by its publishers on YouTube. So sharing that audio with your students can be a treat because they see the visual of the comic, but also hear it narrator. And it's a fantastic mentor text in so many ways. But something that I found really useful in particular was the way it showed scenes versus close-ups. So here in this cell, you see an image of Maya. She had been going there and planting in this community garden space only to show up one day and see that a company had begun to dump some hazardous waste in the community garden. And so this close-up is really affecting because it shows her expression, it shows the shock and displeasure, but it really is the beginning of the complication where it's up to Maya to figure out how she's going to mobilize others in the community to speak at a neighborhood council meeting and really fight for the right to have a healthy gathering space in her community. So how do my students use this? We practice it with a case study, and our topic is trees in the city. And this is quite possibly one of the best discoveries of the last 5 years. One day I stumbled upon Treepedia. And I'm opening up right now. And Treepedia is made by MIT Sensible City Lab, and it allows you to explore the presence of green canopy in cities around the world. And you can see with these visuals side-by-side comparisons. So I'm just scrolling down to Los Angeles. There it is. And so if you click a city, this Treepedia uses Google Street View imagery to measure the presence of tree canopy. And tree canopy, as I'm sure you know, is a really important indicator of the healthiness of a place, because the more trees there are, the more access you have to clean air, a natural cooling system. And again, these wonderful places to gather in urban settings. And so I grabbed some images. Here you see in Los Angeles, kind of northwestern Los Angeles. And you see by the amount of green that there appears to be quite a few trees, a lot of tree canopy in northwestern LA. But if you were to maneuver the graph and then scroll and look at southern Los Angeles, particularly over here by our international airport, you see that it's not very green at all. And in fact, you can infer that there's not as much tree canopy. And so for my students who grew up here in various places in LA, this is always kind of a starkly memorable moment to see, like, wow, there's really not a lot of trees in southern LA. And it makes them understand that depending on where you live, depending upon where your community is and how many trees are there, it really can make the difference in the amount and intensity of asthma, the amount of headaches produced by pollution. And if you do spend some time playing with Treepedia, you'll see that by looking at the green index score, you can see how the amount of trees compare with cities with similar population densities. So Los Angeles, its index score is much lower than other cities with the same amount of people, suggesting that we don't have as many trees as would be ideal. And so what we did is my students plotted their storyboard comics about the necessity or the importance of trees in urban settings. And they focused on different areas in Los Angeles County to tell their story. And it was really great how this evolved from them just day one playing with the storyboard cells, trying to move these figures and add speech bubbles, to creating an actual storyboard that has a situation, a complication, and a resolution. And this, as I said before, is a rehearsal for conversations that are with bigger audiences and maybe greater stakes. So what we did after researching tree canopy and plotting our comics is we actually did a community presentation in our school gym where we invited families and other community members to come hear what we had to say about this topic. And at this time, there was an assembly bill in our state, Assembly Bill 1530, which was urging votes for more funding for urban forestry. So our community presentation was about, this is what we've learned. We really thought about this in comic form. This connects to environmental justice. And we distributed postcards so they could mail postcards to our local representative. And so you see an example here, the situation surrounded by the natural beauty of Mulholland Park. I wondered how more students could stand where I'm standing and have access to a much needed source of peace. But without protected tree canopy, many LA communities will suffer increased incidence of respiratory diseases, as well as from nature deficit disorder. Urban heat island and drought conditions will become more intense. Therefore, contact your representative to urge support for Assembly Bill 1530. We need urban forestry funding for a resilient, more sustainable future. And what was so wonderful about doing that presentation is I actually had some students go to a local conference and share this message with an even broader audience, so that you can see, by focusing on these storytelling skills in your classroom, there's a multiplying effect, that you have more storytellers and more audiences, and even more storytellers and even more audience. And this really demonstrates how you can cultivate these scholar activists. I want to transition to another lesson idea, a poetry pairing. If you have any questions that come up during this webinar, feel very comfortable adding them to the chat. I'll try to address them by the end. And so this poem pairing, two poems, Notes from a Climate Victory Garden by Louise Meyer Johnson, and then Victor by Heather Swan. And in a Moving Writers post from a little less than a year ago, I talked about other ways I bring Victor into the classroom. But this pairing has been really great. So I wanted to discuss it tonight. And what I tell my students before we read them and spend some time with each is, looking at the poem's titles, how do they appear to offer different connotations of the word victory? To begin with the first poem, I show them historical images of the World War victory gardens that many governments promoted during World War time. This image is in San Francisco in 1943. You can see a dad with his daughter and her Girl Scout friends working and tending a victory garden that was intended not only to supplement the food rations, but also to boost morale. And so when you think about it, victory gardens are a great symbol of a shared collective effort at boosting morale, but also a really wonderful image for how we can be more sustainable. And so I show these pictures to my students before reading this poem. I'm just waiting for it to load. It's available on poets.org. Notes from a Climate Victory Garden. Rebalance greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, water vapor with photosynthesis. Recognize plants cool by evaporation, ground cover, shade, and precipitation. Replant lawns with victory gardens as in World War past. Regenerate biodiverse farms with trees, flowers, herbs, pastures, animals. Restore carbon out of air and back into soils where it belongs. Replace industrial monocultures with regenerative permacultures. Revisit food production by many small farms, not a few mega farms. Reject fossil fuel-based pesticides, plastics, and propaganda. Rethink healthy ecosystems and economies for all life. Relocalize slow food, slow lifestyles, and slow economies. Rekindle simple and good, nature and nurture, feeling over thinking. Refill kinship with pivoting sunflowers and starry fireflies. Revive wildness, woodlands, wetlands, wildlife, waterways. Reestablish health of bees, butterflies, birds, bats, beetles. Respect work of insects, both pollinating and recomposing life. Remember, everything is connected. everyone lives downstream and downwind. Reimagine deep conservation, cooperation, and community. Rebalance nature with nature. Mimic her, sense her, be her. And so when my students and I read that poem, one of the first things we notice is that calls to action are woven throughout. Maybe it's because we read so many speeches when we're juniors, but we tend to think of the call to action only appearing at the end, like that hard ask at the end of a speech. But they were struck by how many actions were recommended in the poem. We're also really struck by the sense of kinship, not just with other human beings, but with other animals and landscapes. The use of verbs with the prefix re, which means again and again, as organizing the structure of this poem. And really stepping back, thinking about how so many of these calls are alternatives to status quo thinking and behavior. And so this really connects, as I said earlier, with thinking about impact. What are the ways we can reduce atmospheric carbon? What are the ways we can stop interrupting food chains in dangerous ways? How can we work to not create negative feedback loops? And really having all these suggestions for how we can norm new habits. And so to begin to dig into the poem and work with it, we look at the terms that are the most mystifying to my students. And by far and away, monocultures and permacultures, almost all of them don't really know those terms. And so we use a strategy that actually I read about in a Moving Writers post by Hattie McGuire, why this, not that. And so I took some of the built-in uses of antithesis or alternatives in the poem, monoculture versus permaculture, lawns versus victory gardens, fast food versus slow food, and mega farms versus small farms. And we take the term and think about why this instead of that. So it's really asking students to not only do a little bit of research and find out more about the term, but also justify the rationale of why the poem speaker would say this is a superior way to be sustainable, or this is the way to be sustainable. And so, as Hattie says in this post, this is a really great way to move your students from merely describing, that is, merely identifying, say, the use of literary devices, to actually analyzing, figuring out why would we advocate for this choice? Why would it have a healthier impact? And so ways that you can build this poem into your classroom is in thinking impact. How does choosing, say, monoculture or victory gardens or the slow food movement reduce our footprint and help us avoid an adverse tipping point? Access. What would it take to norm new habits around, say, permaculture? And so thinking about the difference between those two terms, monoculture is really the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, where in the effort to maximize yield, crop yield, you just plant the same thing over and over again in the same place. And the problem is that really degrades the quality of the soil and really halts biodiversity in that landscape. And so thinking about permaculture, what's that? My students don't know. Listening and reading to regenerative farmers who are thinking about natural cooling systems and not such intensive inputs like oil or coal to do the agricultural work. And then practice, what actions could we take to show our shared commitment to keeping our planet habitable? What would a modern day victory garden look like? And my students do speak to the presence of community gardens that they've seen in several places, but what else could be that visible representation of this collective commitment to keeping our planet habitable? So these questions have been really productive for teasing out the implications of this poem. And to think more about impact We then look at Heather Swan's poem, Victor. And before we even read the poem, it's really important for students to understand that there's actually a pesticide that's called Victor. And something that the poet has said herself is that, ironically, many pesticides have very pleasant, positive names and connotations like Victor or Vespers. And it's almost distracting in many ways from the goal of the pesticide use. And so let's look at Victor by Heather Swan. I'm just scrolling down. I'll begin to read. The handfuls of dead bees she finds after the spraying are not the worst part for the beekeeper. It's the bees still struggling that gets to her, limping in a circle like someone who's been spinning on a tire swing for too long, who then stands, dizzy, nauseous, stunned. Their wings shudder, but they cannot fly. These insects whose bodies know the rhythm of the blossoms, the changing angles of the sun, whose alchemy gives us liquid gold, whose love affairs with pistils and stamens give us apricots, almonds, melons. To witness is to be dredged, she thinks. What war do we think we're winning? When my students and I talk about our poem noticings, something that I'm struck by is how often they mention that this poem seems to be registering a disappearing, how our precious pollinators, our bees, how they're slowly leaving, and we don't really register that in terms of huge. That actually my students tell me most frequently when I think of bees, I think of a pest that wants to sting me. I don't actually think that they're like a vital part of any local ecosystem. We talk about the irony present in the pesticide's name. Victor, who is really winning here? What war do we think we're winning? And we talk very poignantly about how names can so often obscure the violence and the harm that's taking place. And my students will connect the name of Victor for this pesticide actually with the name of the company in Maya's Lot, the comic, because the company that wants to continue to dump this waste in this garden, it's called Green Solutions. It sounds so pleasant and sustainable, but that really has nothing to do with its intentions. And something else that we remark upon is how this poem can seem both like an ode and an elegy, that it's really celebrating the bee in itself, but also how much we benefit from its presence, but also mourning again this disappearance over time. And so when we pair these texts, we consider these moves as well with Victor. Repetition through the use of verbs with identical prefix. So the idea of rebalance that we read in the first poem, how could we rebalance the ecosystem so that our bees have a chance? Embedding antithesis to suggest alternatives. We saw that really clearly in the first poem, the opposites. Here it's also implied, right? That we think we're winning, but actually we're losing. And like we're all losing, not just the bees. And this poem, ending the poem with a question. My students talk about how when they think of like the use of a question, they think of like a corny hook at the beginning of an essay. But here, ending with a question is used to such poignant effect. What war do we think we're winning? This is an example from a student notebook of a brief writing exercise we use to explore what's really happening in the poem Victor. And if you're familiar with Explode the Moment or not, it's an exercise that when you write, you're including as much sensory details as possible. So it almost creates a slow motion effect. And I find this to be a really great way to help students process the imagery in poems. That when I was a newer teacher, I rushed to like literary device identification, but I don't think that I need to do that as much if I use a more creative exercise like explode the moment. And so their wings shudder, but they cannot fly. Handfuls of bees struggling and dying at the hands of the victor, spraying onto their colonies a harsh chemical that will wipe the population out. A slow death with a fast-acting chemical, just like cleaning, wiping down a dirty surface with a clean solution that can easily dissolve through built-up dirt, like the extermination of pests that are sprayed down with pesticides that act fast, but for the pests, it's a slow and suffering process for them. It's the bees that still struggle after the victor, and so on. And so the writer is exploring the imagery in the poem through adding her own sensory details, but also she's using the mentor text move of using a simile to kind of expand the imagery of the poem. In Swan's poem, you hear how the bees dizzy, like on a rope swing almost. And here it's like you just quickly wipe away the bee as if with a fast-acting chemical. And this act of erasure is so violent. And I think really powerfully explode through this explode the moment writing sample. And this is something that I learned along the way, that when I first tried to embed ecological literacy in my teaching, I try to do a lot of front loading with poems. So I might say keystone species, fossil fuel divestment, renewables. And I gave this list to my students as if like it was tremendously helpful. And I realize now how much more valuable it is to read a poem that presents a situation about the climate crisis and then introduce the concept that relates to it. It's more memorable that way. And so as Pat Thomas says here, give bees a chance. Bees are what is known as a keystone species, ensuring the continued reproduction and survival, not only of plants, but other organisms that depend on those plants for survival. And this is such an important concept to think about how they're part of these food chains that may not be visible to us. And I noticed that in these larger units about climate stewardship, that the idea of keystone species stays with my students, that they'll start talking about the dying coral reefs, which is a keystone species. They'll start talking about the successful reintroduction of gray wolves in Yellowstone National Park and how that absolutely transformed the local ecosystems for all the better. And so it's an important term, but again, not one I just want to drop on them at the beginning of a lesson or a unit. Another concept that is really important is Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence. And he describes this in his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And he describes it as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violent or delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. And my students find this concept so helpful because it makes clear to us the difficulty of getting regular access to substantive news reporting about the climate crisis. It's not so much that, journalists aren't doing their due diligence. It's actually really hard to talk about climate impacts because often they're taking place invisibly or slowly and gradually over time. And, it's not this quick time lapse. It's really easy to see. And so that makes reporting hard. But it also gives them ammunition, my students ammunition to talk about climate problems that take place in the slow, gradual way because they're not visible and easy to see. And so we keep that term in mind as we pivot to another really fun lesson idea, which was making mini zines about restoring our planet. And we did this recently, actually, and it was so much fun. We actually made this for a class at nearby middle school, a 6th grade class. And that makes it more special when your students know that they're making a mini zine for a real audience of students even younger than themselves. They just approach and tackle it differently. And so our goals were to describe a local environmental problem, to share knowledge about a problem. And my students chose the problem they wish to focus on. It's so important to give them that agency, something that they wish to share more information about, and how to mitigate that problem. And again, in terms of practice, making sure that we're sharing this action with a real audience. And so I think it took us, and we were reading different environmental texts simultaneously, but I think it took us about a week to work on these little mini zines. And we did use the ABT structure of situation, complication, and resolution, because these mini zines only had 8 pages. They had to be really concise and clear. But we decided, as we thought about how we could make a zine with 24 pages or 16 pages, that 8 was good for giving clarity and making the call to action more memorable to a younger student audience. So again, this is a way to build capacity, engage in local storytelling, and again, find those authentic audience for student work. So we actually had to watch these YouTube videos about how to properly fold our zines, because we did make some mistakes initially. And then one way that I would like to suggest that can really help students figure out the story, the narrative of their zine, is think about these harmful assumptions. I just want to ask everyone to mute themselves so we don't get some feedback. Thank you so much. And so these 4 harmful mindset assumptions come from a great article in the Canadian publication Green Teacher magazine. And I treasure Green Teacher. It's an amazing magazine. And the article was written by John Gueckler, Teaching for the Future, Systems Thinking and Sustainability. And in this article, he talks about these mindset assumptions that really are the underlying mindset habits that cause so many of our problems. And so the first one is constant and unlimited growth in business is not only possible, but essential. The second one is humans have dominion over the earth. The third one is nature is income. Resources are free because we found them. And the fourth, if we destroy our environment, we can simply move or invent some new technology to solve it. And so we unpack each of these assumptions by thinking about what do each of these really mean. And what can be a great writing exercise is thinking about, you've learned about these mindset assumptions. Which one do you consider to be the biggest threat to our planet's viability as a home for future generations? Explain why. And this actually produces a lot of great debate because they're all so influential, these harmful mindset assumptions. I notice over and over again, when I do some informal polling, my students say the last one, if we destroy our environment, we can simply move or invent some new technology. They say that's the most dangerous. So when I ask my students why, they think it's, if you just move somewhere else, some, planet that is habitable, who's to say you won't just replicate the same harmful behaviors, right? You don't actually learn from the mistakes or the problematic thinking. You just find a new place that perhaps you will replicate them again and again. So all of them, though, play a huge role in our climate crisis. And so this is when I connect the EcoZine writing with our recently released UN climate report. And this is a doozy. This is 4,000 pages. It had 234 authors. It had, I think, 14,000 citations from scientific studies worldwide. It's a beast, and it's an alarming beast. And even the one they met made as a summary for policymakers is still 40 pages, and it's dense. But we extracted the most pressing point, which is we need to keep our planet from warming beyond certain thresholds. So 1.5 could be survivable, but 2 degrees Celsius would be catastrophic. And so thinking about how this will produce dangerous extreme weather events, this will happen in nearly every corner of the globe, that our goal as climate stewards is that if we stabilize the climate system, we can stay clear of the largest changes. And that absolutely is the goal. And so this is something we have in mind. And here's a direct image from the report as we're working on our little eco-zines. I just wanted to share with you some of the zines that I think produce the most delight. Friendly fashion, which actually taught me a lot. In this zine, my student talked about how fast fashion, so fashion that's quickly produced, how harmful it can be, that actually a lot of chemicals and waste are produced. It fills landfills at a really fast rate and attributes 1.2 billion tons of carbon emissions per year. And you'll see how my student illustrated this with the little ghosts appearing behind the sewing machine. Very clever. And then another student played with some story tropes. So their zine was playing with the idea of superheroes. And so the villain in this superhero story is pollution. But it's important to think of multiple ways to attack and fight off pollution. And I love this quote from the zine on the right side. Remember, your impact may not be seen, but the earth 100% feels it. You got this. So I love that this student writer was really aware of audience, how so many students love superheroes, are so familiar with the Marvel universe, and playing with the idea of what villain you're going to fight if you're a hero now. This zine, I can really see the clear influence of our reading of Victor beforehand, but it's really lovely the way it's illustrated. But what I love about it is he says one way, it's very important to help the bees. One way we can do this is by buying our food from places that do not use toxic pesticides. Another way to help is planting plants that bees like in our own gardens. Plants include lavender, sunflowers, and mint. And I thought this was really great because this is something you could easily, if you're a young student, talk about with your family. You know, let's do some local rewilding. We can do this. This is something that's not a huge, grandiose plan. We can do this in our own yard or in a community garden to plant things that are hospitable to our precious pollinators. I love the title of the zine, They're Home Too. And this is about a day at the beach and how someone is really thinking about how all the sea life is experiencing the glut of trash in the ocean, and thinking about how are they feeling. And this is something that I noticed time and again, that when you have students frequently engage in environmental storytelling, their sense of ecological attachment really comes forth in the form of empathy and concern, and it does help them step up their conservation efforts. So this student talks about how her young readers should volunteer with Heal the Bay or Surfrider Foundation or some other local organization doing the work every weekend. And just these last two, which crack me up. The one on the left, Saving Green Eggs. I didn't know what this was going to be about. And it's actually a really effective zine about food waste in Los Angeles County. And what makes this a great place-based call to action is it gives you clear recommendations about how you can help avoid food waste, and includes stark statistics about malnutrition and how being wasteful, if we weren't wasteful, there's so many problems we could address at the same time. So Saving Green Eggs and Ham. And on the right, I love first the illustration, but this is about litter bugs. This menace isn't anything super villainous or evil, but they even look like the average person. No, they are just average people. They're known as litter bugs. And I just thought that was really clever, the playfulness, but also making the hugely important point that, the environmental villains, they're not a Marvel supervillain. They're people just like you and me that are perhaps very busy and just need to work collaboratively to be more sustainable. On a last note, because I always like to bring it back to nature connection, is thinking about what are the mentor texts available for nature writing? How does nature writing invite playfulness? And what texts offer models for noticing the natural world? And this was so important in the last 2 years, especially, at least for me, doing at least a year of remote learning where we started a school year of remote learning. We were staying at home, but also we had some local fires to the northeast of us, the Bobcat fire. And so the air quality was horrible. So you really couldn't go outside and take a walk or jog or anything like that without really suffering some ill effects. So my students had this heightened sense of being trapped. They were inside because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also couldn't even take a walk because the air quality was so bad on account of a local wildfire. And so I wanted to share with them some nature poetry to kind of approximate that sense of enjoying nature and feeling renewed by it. And so to that end, I want to share a poem by Amy Nesu-Matatul. And this is really lovely. And if you break this up with your students, giving student each stanza, it's great to hear read aloud. Sea church. Give me a church made entirely of salt. Let the walls hiss and smoke when I return to shore. I ask for the grace of a new freckle on my cheek, the lift of blue, and my mother's soapy skin to greet me. Hide me in a room with no windows. Never let me see the dolphins leaping into commas. For this water prayer rising like a host of sky lanterns into the inky evening. Let them hang in the sky until they vanish at the edge of the constellations, the heroes and animals too busy and bright to notice. And it's such a lovely poem. And so one way I bring this into my classroom is to use an idea I encountered in the book Image Grammar, which is to provide students with a scrambled list of words from the poem. And then using these words as starting points for their own poem, let the images suggest new images. So it's kind of like an image remix. And so what this can look like, what I did is I just went through this poem and made some columns of the words, all the words that appear in this poem. And I say, use found images and words to generate new images, begin writing. And so they often stare at the page and are like, what am I doing? You're creating a poem from the words that you encountered in the poem we just read. And so they kind of stare, with dismay at these lists. And then they start to play with the words and combine them in these surprising, unexpected ways, where all of a sudden they produce a poem that's entirely different than the poem we read, and yet it's inspired by it. And it's really a remix of the same language. And this brings that playfulness and joy into the classroom, especially when whatever's happening outside makes it hard for our students to enjoy being outside. And it's so much fun. I really recommend this activity. And this is an example. I'm just going to have to zoom out for a second so I can read it. See the lift of blue greet the shore as constellations light up the inky evening with sky lanterns. Notice the grace of animals leaping who vanish from your sight as you reach for your camera. So I was just so impressed by what my student came up with just in this remix of the words they found in the other poem. And as a next step, which I really recommend, just zooming back out. is asking or inviting students to pair their remixed poem with a new word, a word that you hadn't really been talking about in any context, just something that came to mind as they worked on the reworked imagery in their poem. And so with that poem, the word we chose was ephemeral, which is a word meaning lasting for a very short time. And we felt like this word captured what was so beautiful about the imagery in Sea Church, that these things you see in the setting, they're fleeting, they don't last forever. But because of that, it makes them extra beautiful and precious. And with that said, we also can partner this with another activity called creating a word pool. And I just showed you here a picture of a narrowleaf milkweed here in the Angeles National Forest. This is in winter, denuded of flowers. But I still think it's very beautiful. And this is the larval host plant from the monarch butterfly. And so something that Susan Goldsmith Worldridge recommends in her book, Poem Crazy, is to invite your students to create a word pool. And so that looks like something like this. Instead of creating a list busy with definitions and parts of speech, invite them to create some sort of representation where they're just collecting the words that have to do with that topic in mind. And so with the monarch butterfly, I threw these words into an example word pool, endemic pattern, seed cloud, monarch butterflies, endangered larval host plant, narrowleaf stem, milkweed, native, memories, hope. And it's just really fun to play with language, and I think creates that joy that we can experience when we're outside. So I just want to thank everyone for attending. And I just want to invite you at this point to share any comments or throw out any questions that you have that may have come to mind in the last hour. And if you're just tuckered out by your day, that's okay too. I see some comments popping up in the chat. Oh, thank you for being here. We're so happy that you came. It's so much fun to talk about these little lesson starts and ideas that had to be reworked and tried again. Constantly trying to make adjustments that better meet my students' needs. And I think climate stewardship is the most pressing need. Oh, I love that you appreciate the ways to frame the poem study, the Student Advocacy for Assembly Bill 1530. Yes, connecting it to a current bill about to be on the legislation floor was serendipity and hugely impactful. Thank you for being here. And a lot of the ideas I touch upon, I've expanded upon or woven with other texts in my Moving Writers posts. So if you visit the website, you're sure to encounter expanded explanation of how I tried out some of these ideas.
Well, Sochi, thank you so much. I think one of the big things that struck me tonight was that, this doesn't have to be an add-on to, it doesn't have to be a separate unit. It doesn't have to be one more thing for us to do, even though we're excited to do it. But so much of what you shared tonight was just literacy instruction in general, right? It was just reading strategies, writing strategies, strategies for analyzing texts with this really special and powerful lens. And so that really got me excited that, people can do this in big ways and in small ways, and really weave this idea of environmental advocacy and climate stewardship throughout all of the reading and writing that they're already trying to teach in their classrooms. So thank you so much. I've written down 100 million things. And thank you all so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate you, and we wish you a very happy rest of your school year. Take care.